In the sweltering third week of August 1944, the war in Europe had reached a breaking point, and nobody felt it more sharply than the German General Kurt von der Schiollery. Inside his command post, surrounded by battered maps now faded and ripped by constant updates, the reality was unmistakable. Defeat wasn't just a rumor anymore, it was a storm crashing through France. Schiollery had once been a name that echoed with authority throughout the ranks of the Wehrmacht. He'd commanded infantry on the frozen hellscapes of Kiev, survived the brutal crucible at Valaki, and had the Knight's Cross with oak leaves pinned to his uniform, the kind of honor that set a man apart in Hitler's army. Now those decorations felt impossibly distant. The orders streaming down from Berlin were growing more frantic, stripped of logic, issued by a high command that seemed to know, even if they'd never say it out loud, that this was the endgame. Schiollery's assignment was simple on paper: hold the crumbling German First Army's defensive line in central France, face down the American onslaught, buy time for a desperate Reich. But how do you hold a line that ceases to exist the moment you trace it with your finger? American troops were punching holes so fast and so far apart that by sunrise, roadblocks constructed under darkness were already smoldering ruins, abandoned before anyone could even count the casualties. Every hour the front seemed to unravel even faster, a thread being yanked so quickly there was no chance to knot it back together. German battalions arrived piecemeal, broken, scattered, sometimes nothing more than a huddle of weary survivors deployed into the infamous Paris Orleans Gap. Tanks and half-tracks darted desperately in every direction, thrown into last-ditch defenses that slumped and vanished almost as soon as they appeared. But what set Schiollery apart, even in total chaos, was that he refused to allow a headlong collapse. There were no mass surrenders, no disorganized stampedes. At every bend in the road and every village crossroads, his troops would put up fierce, short-lived resistance, forcing the Americans to fight for every yard. An American intelligence officer watching the German defense unfold would later admit, almost grudgingly, that the way Schiollery delayed, defended, then pulled back again was a remarkable feat of battlefield command. That respect tellingly came not from Berlin but from his determined enemies. On September 6, the Nazi leadership finally lost its patience and sacked him outright, a scapegoat for a disaster nobody could control. By the following spring, his fate vanished entirely into the fog of war. April 1945, lost somewhere amidst the swirling ruins on the Eastern Front, swept away by the advancing Red Army, he was declared missing in action and never heard from again. There would be no memoirs, no post-war interviews. The man who once stood in front of the situation map, watching his nation's plans dissolve, would never have the chance to explain how it felt, staring at incoming reports that spelled doom in real time. Yet while Schiollery vanished into obscurity, the real tectonic shift in August 1944 wasn't just the German collapse, it was the unstoppable force sweeping across those same maps. Because as the German lines fell apart, a new kind of war machine was picking up unstoppable momentum. The United States Third Army, commanded by a general no one in Berlin had ever truly understood or anticipated. And just behind the shattered German defenses, even the veteran Nazi generals were grudgingly beginning to realize that World War II's rules were being rewritten by Americans in real time, faster than anyone at Hitler's headquarters could even imagine. But what exactly were the Americans doing that ripped up the old rulebook? How did an army built in the space of mere months tear through the veteran Wehrmacht at speeds no one thought possible, while the legends of Blitzkrieg watched powerless from the ruins of France? What happened next would not only change the course of the war but leave German commanders stunned, and forever alter the way America thought about victory, command, and the very nature of modern combat. If there was ever a general who didn't look the part, it was George S. Patton, Jr. In war movies and stale documentaries, history likes its heroes polished and predictable. But Patton was nothing of the sort, a contradiction in boots, as uncomfortable at cocktail parties as he was electric on a battlefield. In 1944, his name was whispered with awe and sometimes open fear, not just in Berlin, but inside Allied headquarters. This was the American general built out of grit, impatience, and a lifetime of hard-fought lessons most didn't bother to learn. And no one, not even his own superiors, truly predicted how far he'd push the boundaries of warfare. Patton's path to legend didn't start on some parade ground or West Point honor roll. Born in California in 1885, he didn't just inherit a legacy, he built one brick by brick, book by excruciating book. Raised on the wild stories of Civil War clashes and the thunder of cavalry charges, his childhood was drenched in military history. Before he could read clearly, he could ride a horse, and his mind was trained on classic war stories, the Iliad instead of fairy tales, Napoleon's campaigns instead of bedtime fables. But the truth was that Patton struggled for every academic inch. He failed his first year at West Point because he couldn't hack the math. His spelling was so chaotic that some in the Army thought he was lazy or careless. Today, psychologists would call it dyslexia, a diagnosis unknown to the world he inhabited, a hidden battle that pushed him to work harder, read deeper, and write ideas into notebooks with the tenacity of a man who refused to be outdone by anybody, least of all himself. While other officers polished boots or counted combat ribbons, Patton devoured military philosophy. He read Clausewitz's On War on his honeymoon in London, wrestled with Caesar's Gallic Wars, and obsessed over the writings of Basil Liddell Hart, the British theorist hellbent on revolutionizing military tactics. He scribbled insights in his own maxims notebook, some signed with his initials, others Napoleon or even Caesar, depending on the mood. Everything he read became ammunition, not for parade ground glory, but for some future battle no one else could see coming. Yet America's army, for most of the 1920s and 1930s, was a backwater, ignored by Congress and overshadowed by bigger, older militaries. Tank warfare was dismissed, left to rust under infantry command. Patton, denied the chance to experiment with armor after World War I, was pushed back into the saddle, quite literally, overseeing sleepy cavalry posts while secretly sculpting the future of U.S. armored tactics in his head. His wife B. Patton once compiled a list of the books and journals he worked through. It ran longer than some generals' war diaries. The real turning point, the event that set Patton on his path, came not on a battlefield but in the wilds of Texas and Louisiana. In 1941, Pat took charge of the 2nd Armored Division during the Louisiana maneuvers, a colossal wargame that would define the next generation of American command. When his tanks ran dry, he paid out of pocket for gasoline at civilian filling stations, refusing to let rules or reality slow him down. The exercise judges called him reckless. Patton famously shot back, "I was unaware of the existence of any rules in war." That single line, equal parts humor and warning, captured the unique energy Patton poured into every mission. Rules were for breaking and war was for winning, not explaining. But behind the brash public persona, the man with ivory-handled revolvers and a voice that could split steel, lurked the meticulous planner, the solitary reader, still grinding away for every inch of wisdom he could extract from history's greatest generals. Fellow officers sometimes dismissed the act as showmanship, but those closest knew Patton's mind was as sharp as his tongue. He didn't just want to win, he wanted to rewrite the playbook, to prove that America could outthink as well as outfight its enemies. Still, Patton wasn't immune to public scandal. In Sicily, just a year before the Normandy invasion, he slapped 2 American soldiers suffering from battle fatigue, a mistake that nearly ended his career. U.S. headlines blared about his harsh command style, and even General Eisenhower briefly considered shipping Patton back to the States in disgrace. But the war machine was moving too quickly, and soon enough, circumstances proved that no one could drive men forward with Patton's fierce blend of discipline and daring. By the summer of 1944, when fate finally handed him the keys to Third Army, it wasn't the polished, rule-following general who showed up in France. It was the relentless innovator. Forged by decades of trial, error, and burning self-doubt, the man Berlin had underestimated would soon make history as the American general who turned blitzkrieg on its head and transformed the very idea of what the U.S. military could achieve in the heart of Europe. But Patton's story would matter for more than individual glory, because his rise against every odd and every setback became the blueprint for an army that would soon tear through everything the German high command thought was immovable, and forever change the outcome of World War II. The story of Patton's Third Army in August 1944 isn't just a tale of tactics, it's a record-smashing sprint that stunned even the battle-hardened German high command. As soon as Patton took the reins at noon August 1st, his army didn't just start moving, they surged like a flood from a broken dam across the battle-scarred heart of France. What followed wasn't just speed, it was an unstoppable surge that experts on both sides would later call miraculous. On paper, Patton's Third Army didn't look unstoppable. Many divisions had never seen combat. The force had been pieced together quickly, its commanding general left in England during D-Day as a decoy. But when permission to advance finally dropped, the American drive was nothing less than electrifying. Patton divided his forces like a master chess player, one corps tearing west to clear the Brittany Peninsula, grabbing ports crucial for Allied supply lines, another pushing east, protecting the fracture between the Americans and the natural barrier of the Loire River, another spearheaded south and east, capturing towns and trapping fleeing German infantry. With each decision, Patton's command proved agile, ready to switch targets, pivot strategy, outthink the foe. What did this look like on the ground? Within a week, Third Army's eastern elements seized the towns of Mayenne and Laval. On August 8, the 79th Infantry Division stormed Le Mans, chopping apart the retreating German 7th Army's command hub. 5 days later, American armor was already sitting south of Argenton, closing the jaws of what would become the infamous Falaise Pocket, a killing ground so devastating that Eisenhower himself would walk through the carnage, describing how you could go for hundreds of yards, step by step, on nothing but bodies and the ruins of war. The numbers were beyond anything most generals had seen. Up to 50,000 German prisoners, over 10,000 enemy troops wiped out, and hundreds of Nazi tanks, armored vehicles, and artillery pieces left smoldering in place. And yet Patton wasn't satisfied. He argued fiercely to push north and slam the pocket shut, believing total destruction was within reach. Held back by concerns of friendly fire with British and Canadian armies converging from the north, Patton's ambition still carried his columns east, faster than any book of military doctrine had ever imagined. Within just 2 weeks, Third Army had covered nearly 300 miles. By August's end, that number soared over 400 miles of contested ground, all while throttling forward at a pace most armies could never dream of. Bridge after bridge fell into American hands, sometimes just minutes before German demolition teams arrived. On the night of August 19, Patton's infantry crept across the Seine behind enemy lines, using footpaths and assault boats. By the time sun rose, U.S. Army engineers were already hammering together temporary bridges across the river. The original invasion planners expected the Americans to cross the Seine 90 days after D-Day. Patton's men did it in 75 days, breaking every deadline and leaving the enemy reeling. Each river, each shattered resistance pocket, wrote a new chapter in the legend. The drive wasn't just about territory, but about shattering the myth of German invincibility. The roads and rivers that had once stopped previous Allied campaigns became little more than markers on a victory lap, as armored columns rolled past names that had been etched in World War I lore: the Loire, the Seine, the Marne, the Aisne, the Meuse. Verdun, site of one of the deadliest battles of the previous war, became just another checkpoint seized by American momentum, its defenders so stunned that they couldn't even sabotage the bridges before being overrun. Patton's Third Army became a force of legend, earning the nickname Ghost Army for its ability to simply disappear from German maps and reappear far behind enemy lines, taking vital towns with dizzying speed. Old-school German generals who once prided themselves on blitzkrieg now found their own yardsticks of rapid advance overtaken by the Americans' relentless push. Their own divisions, built for speed, could barely keep up on horseback and battered trucks, while U.S. armor powered forward on gasoline, steel, and sheer audacity. What the U.S. Army accomplished from Normandy to the Moselle in 1 month wasn't just an operational success, it was a strategic thunderbolt. The Germans had written the textbook on modern mobile warfare, but in the high summer of 1944, Patton's army took that script, rewrote it, and handed it back torn and burning. The message was clear: American military power, driven by innovation, aggression, and an industrial base that could supply victory, wasn't just catching up. It was outpacing the very best that Europe had to offer. But Patton's miracle wasn't only about steel and speed. Underneath the surface, hidden from headlines, were the unsung systems, the networks and unknown heroes that made these world-shifting achievements possible. What powered this supercharged advance? The answer would reveal a secret strength behind America's wartime machine, an edge that went far beyond rifles and tanks, reshaping forever what it meant to be an army on the move. The legend of Patton's unstoppable Third Army wasn't built on brute force alone. Beneath the roar of tank engines, behind the smoke and headlines, the real miracle was a uniquely American formula: trust, improvisation, and grit, steering the most advanced command structure the world had ever seen. In the classic German blitzkrieg, every move depended on strict orders from above. But as the U.S. Army stormed through France, a new reality took shape. Victory came from empowering local commanders, trusting their instincts, and unleashing a wave of initiative that allowed American forces to move not only fast but smart. The men chosen to lead Patton's armored columns were more than generals. They were pioneers handpicked for their mental agility and readiness to adapt at full throttle. One of the quietest and sharpest was Major General John Shirley Wood, commander of the 4th Armored Division. At West Point, classmates called him the Professor. On the battlefield, his men called him Tiger Jack. Wood was no glory hound. He was a master of maneuver, a linguist fluent in French, a military theorist who devoured British and German books on armored warfare. In the tense first days of the breakout from Normandy, Wood didn't hide behind maps or paperwork. He was there in the front lines, earning the Distinguished Service Cross by leading his tanks straight into the German breach, ignoring every textbook caution about risk. But what truly set Wood apart was his stubborn belief in mission command, what Americans now call command by intent. He didn't drown subordinates in orders. He made sure every major, captain, and sergeant knew what needed to happen, then gave them free rein to decide how. Speed wasn't just a goal, it was a living doctrine. Wood once told his corps commander that fighting in Brittany was a waste of time. The true war, he argued, was to the east, beyond the flat Atlantic coast. The official orders said otherwise, and for a moment Wood's outspokenness nearly cost him. But history would later prove him right. Every hour spent mopping up rearguard garrisons was one the enemy used to regroup. When the green light finally came, Wood's division moved with such velocity that both his superiors and subordinates struggled to keep up. The 4th Armored covered over 400 hard-fought miles in a matter of weeks, cracking open enemy positions and seizing crossings the Germans thought untouchable. Wood embodied the American adaptation of what the Germans had once called Auftragstaktik, leading by objective and trusting the fighting instincts of experienced officers. Nothing demonstrated this better than the drive on Troyes in late August. Colonel Bruce C. Clark, leading a combat command, faced a German garrison dug in with anti-tank guns and open fields designed to massacre American tanks. But Clark, a product of U.S. Army war colleges and a man Patton admired tremendously, didn't follow the expected playbook. Instead, he ordered his Shermans into a broad line, guns blazing, charging at high speed to punch through enemy defenses before the Germans could zero in. Supporting infantry followed, innovating, pushing, sometimes inventing tactics on the move. When the town fell, Patton himself arrived to award Clark the Distinguished Service Cross. But in the chaos of battle, the medal had been forgotten at headquarters, so Patton simply tore the medal from his own uniform and pinned it on Clark's chest. It was a living symbol of the American way: speed, audacity, and trust, not just from the top, but at every level right down to the youngest officer. The driving force of Patton's system wasn't top-down control, it was an organization built for motion where everyone from division commander to sergeant at the front had license to act, innovate, and outpace the enemy. Clark would later sum up the entire campaign: "I went 500 miles on 2 words. Those words, spoken by Patton, were simply, "Go east." The brilliance of this approach turned the American army into a force the Germans weren't prepared to confront. Instead of waiting for instructions or paralyzed by hierarchy, U.S. soldiers operated like a living organism, reacting to opportunity. Decision-making was decentralized. Boldness, not conformity, was rewarded. American colonels didn't stand back in staff cars. They led column charges, read enemy weaknesses in real time, and understood that stalling meant disaster. When headquarters needed to catch up, it caught up later. On these roads, hesitation was the only true enemy. And while generals wrote orders and colonels wrote history, it was the ordinary American G.I., armed with nothing but a rifle, a helmet, and the words "Go East," who carried this leadership philosophy over every bridge, across every hedgerow, and into towns and cities still echoing with the ghosts of past wars. Patton himself knew that success required this unique American synthesis, a harmony of discipline and freedom, training and improvisation, textbook and gut instinct. By unlocking the potential in every unit, squad, and driver, he turned the U.S. Army into an agile, thinking machine, less a traditional army than a rolling, relentless network of American initiative and resolve. But for all the genius and courage at the command level, the truth was that even the best ideas needed fuel, bullets, and bread. The next great advantage of the U.S. war machine came not from the history books, but from the American highways, where a new kind of unsung hero kept the army marching forward as world history trembled at the pace. So, who were these invisible giants working through the night, powering the greatest advance in U.S. military history? The stunning story of American logistics is next, and without it, even Patton's audacity would have run out of gas. Superior tactics and bold leadership might win battles, but in war it's supply chains that win campaigns. In August 1944, while General Patton's tanks and infantry tore across France faster than any army before them, the single greatest advantage of the United States wasn't a new weapon or secret technology. It was a thriving, relentless logistical system powered by American ingenuity and the Red Ball Express. Patton's Third Army moved like a storm, but storms run on fuel. While the world's attention focused on Sherman tanks and thunderous artillery, the true heartbeat of the American advance was gasoline. Hundreds of thousands of gallons burned daily as columns roared eastward, always threatening to outrun their own lifeline. By mid-August, the threat wasn't German tanks but empty fuel gauges. Without a miracle, Patton's blitz would stop dead in its tracks. Enter the Red Ball Express, a logistical operation so audacious that it could only have been born in America, home of the 12-hour workday, cross-country highways, and the spirit of get it done at any cost. The name itself, Red Ball, came from railroad slang for fast freight, a symbol of non-stop priority movement. When French railroads lay in ruins from Allied bombing raids, American planners improvised, turning roads across Normandy and France into a 24/7 highway reserved exclusively for frontline supply. It was an operation on a scale the world had never witnessed. At its peak, nearly 6,000 U.S. Army trucks thundered down routes marked with red disc signs, a never-ending column shuttling ammunition, food, and most importantly, high-octane fuel from the beaches of Normandy to Patton's forward edge. American soldiers called their trucks Jimmies and drove them day and night through shell holes and burning towns. But the greatest heroes of the Red Ball Express weren't generals, they were the drivers. Three-quarters of them were African-American GIs, pulled from segregated units that the U.S. Army in its prejudice had designated as support troops. Now the nation's fate depended on their courage and exhaustion-defying willpower. Most had never driven a truck before the war, trained instead as mechanics or stevedores. Yet under the relentless sun and rain of the French countryside, they hauled vital supplies at a breakneck pace. The army told them, drive, sleep, eat, repeat, and so they did. Sergeant John O'Leary summed up their experience in one haunting line: Patton wanted us to drive, sleep, and drive, but mostly drive. Men like Robert Emmerich described pushing through pitch-black nights using only blackout lights, hypnotized by the flicker on the dashboard, fighting off sleep behind the wheel. Drowsiness was deadly, but stopping wasn't an option. Some drivers worked 20-hour shifts. Others died gripping the steering wheel, refusing to abandon their cargo in the face of snipers, landmines, and Luftwaffe strafing runs. Even in uniform, they endured the injustice of segregation. The Red Ball drivers were warned not to fraternize with white units. "You just accepted discrimination," said Washington Rector, looking back. "We were told not to cause trouble, but we were fighting for America even if America didn't always fight for us." Their sacrifices paid off on an epic scale. Over 82 days, the Red Ball Express delivered more than 400,000 tons of supplies, fuel, ammunition, rations, keeping Third Army and the entire Allied push alive. The American military-industrial complex, biggest in the world, produced over 800,000 trucks for the war, more than any adversary could imagine. Where the German Wehrmacht still moved supplies on horse-drawn wagons stranded in mud, prey for Allied fighters, U.S. convoys created highways of steel. The world took note. Time magazine declared the Red Ball Express the miracle of supply, a triumph of American willpower and innovation. In 1944, the German army wrote the book on mobile warfare, but the United States printed the new edition. It was written not just with tanks but with diesel fumes and discipline, with coffee-fueled night drives and endless pounding engines. It was built on the backs of unsung, unseen American heroes from every background who risked everything to close the gap between dream and reality. So when Patton's tanks rolled into town after town, the men riding high in the turrets owed their speed, their firepower, and sometimes even their survival to the convoy drivers far behind the front lines, ordinary Americans given an extraordinary mission. This was the real force powering the Allied invasion, the quiet, ceaseless determination of a generation who kept moving, no matter the obstacles, so that America's war machine would never lose momentum. But even as logistics powered Patton's breakneck advance, another weapon was unfolding, a new kind of information warfare. With radios, ciphers, and cutting-edge intelligence, American commanders were outthinking their enemy at every turn, rewriting the rules of blitzkrieg for the modern age. That technological edge would set the stage for Patton's next great advantage, staying one step ahead of the enemy, no matter what the battlefield threw their way. While tanks thundered forward and supply trucks blazed down France's shattered roads, another American advantage crackled silently overhead: networked intelligence and complete air supremacy. In 1944, the German army still fought with courage and experience, but Patton's Third Army faced the enemy with a modern arsenal the world had never seen: code breakers, real-time battlefield communication, and an air force that owned the sky. In the secret war behind the front lines, the United States rewrote the rules of military command. The first and most devastating blow came from signals intelligence. By 1944, U.S. and British cryptanalysts had cracked the vaunted Enigma code. Through the Ultra Project, one of World War II's greatest secrets, American intelligence could eavesdrop directly on the German high command. Within Patton's headquarters, Colonel Oscar Koch led an elite team with access to ultra intelligence, relaying enemy plans, movements, and even intercepted orders as soon as the German generals themselves received them. This was no ordinary field advantage, knowing the enemy's strength location. Desperation in near real time allowed Patton's staff to plot attacks with unprecedented precision. If Hitler ordered a division to defend a river, odds were good that Pat was already storming the next bridge. In one legendary episode, American analysts correctly deduced the German buildup for the future Battle of the Bulge weeks before others in the Allied chain of command took it seriously, proving U.S. intelligence was moving faster than Nazi strategy itself. That intelligence edge supercharged Patton's doctrine. Unlike the ponderous staff work of earlier wars, Patton trained his officers to outpace paperwork. Decisions were driven by actionable information, not hours of debate. Orders arrived as soon as enemy movements were identified. Rapid communication bolstered by an unbreakable network of armored radio vehicles let junior officers react instantly while keeping overall advance coordinated and deadly efficient. But the American advantage didn't stop at radio waves. Overhead, the U.S. Army Air Forces provided a layer of dominance the German Wehrmacht simply could not match. Patton's own 19th Tactical Air Command, led by General Otto P. Wayland, coordinated thousands of fighter bombers. These planes turned the roads ahead of the Third Army into graveyards for German convoys. Any German attempt to reinforce, retreat, or resupply during daylight hours ended in a storm of machine gun fire and rockets from American Thunderbolts and Mustangs. Unlike previous wars, where enemy movement was limited only by weather and luck, the U.S. Air Force made every daylight drive a death sentence for Nazi columns. The result was a level of battlefield paralysis German officers had never experienced before. Wehrmacht divisions, once able to redeploy at will or spring surprise counterattacks, now found themselves trapped by invisible American eyes. Orders from Hitler's headquarters, already slowed by bureaucracy and paranoia, were rendered doubly useless as U.S. intelligence intercepted and responded to every new plan. That speed of both movement and information was the crucial American weapon. While Patton's tanks surged east, the enemy scrambled in the dark, guessing where the next punch would land. German generals privately admitted after the war that their once feared style of mobile warfare had been turned against them. No number of tanks or artillery could compensate for the shock of being consistently outmaneuvered, not just on the ground, but in the invisible war of codes and signals. What made this possible was the uniquely American fusion of technology, training, and trust in decentralized decision-making. Junior officers learned to interpret intelligence, call down airstrikes, and react on their own initiative, all traits the German command, hamstrung by Hitler's endless micromanagement, was rapidly losing. American battlefield communications, switchboard-laden half-tracks, mobile radios in every command car, encrypted teletype links, formed the nervous system of an army built for speed. This was more than a battlefield advantage. It was a vision of total war reimagined through American eyes, information warfare, overwhelming air power, and decisive command all working in harmony. Now, even in the rural villages and ancient forests of France, ground soldiers moved with a god's eye view, while German counterparts struggled with delay, confusion, and mortal uncertainty. From the high-altitude roar of a P-47 Thunderbolt to the crackle of a cryptic radio message in a muddy command tent, the American war machine of 1944 was no longer just powerful, it was omnipresent. But that wasn't the final answer. The truth humiliating every Nazi staff officer in that blazing summer was even simpler. While America outpaced the enemy on land in the skies, and through the airwaves, the core of German military doctrine itself was melting away under the pressure. Why did the inventors of Blitzkrieg find themselves helpless before America's new style of war? The real unraveling, inside the German command, was only just beginning to show. The reality of Patton's blitz across France wasn't just about American hardware or firepower. The collapse of Germany's seemingly invincible war machine revealed a truth that continues to echo through U.S. Army doctrine. In war, the system of command can mean victory or ruin. In the summer of 1944, America's decentralized, fast-reacting military leadership did what no amount of Nazi discipline could counter, a fact remembered by post-war generals on both sides. The myth of the German war machine was built on the concept of Auftragstaktik, what modern armies call mission command. German lieutenants, captains, and majors had once been trained to act on initiative, reading the battlefield and making snap decisions without waiting for distant orders. This command culture had propelled German armies from Warsaw to the gates of Moscow, and across France in 1940 during the original Blitzkrieg. But by the time American forces smashed through the hedgerows of Normandy, something inside that system had snapped. After years of brutal conflict on the Eastern Front, Germany was losing its best officers at a catastrophic rate. Junior men were elevated overnight, lacking the hard-won experience the army depended on. Even more dangerously, Hitler himself began micromanaging the war, trusting no one but himself. By 1944, orders bottlenecked at Nazi headquarters, and any officer who dared make an independent move risked not just demotion, but execution. Following the failed plot against Hitler, the infamous July 20, 1944 bomb attempt led by Colonel Klaus von Stauffenberg, the entire upper command was swept by a wave of paranoia. Hitler's fury led to purges of respected commanders, forced suicides, and courts of honor that sent shockwaves through the Wehrmacht officer corps. Even legends such as Field Marshal Erwin Rommel were removed. Rommel, once the face of Blitzkrieg, took his own life after being accused of complicity in the conspiracy. Gone was the culture of trust. Every officer now looked over his shoulder, more afraid of Berlin than the enemy across the river. Against this background of distrust and centralized control, the U.S. Army's approach looked like lightning. American command wasn't just faster, it was freer. The unique American military philosophy, born from a nation built on autonomy, meant local commanders were not only allowed but expected to act on the fly. When Patton's orders arrived, simple, clear, and urgent, they landed in the hands of men who grew up believing that boldness and adaptation were virtues, not risks. They weren't waiting for Eisenhower or Washington to sign off. They were already crossing bridges, seizing towns, fighting the war in real time. Every step the Germans once took in days, Americans now covered in hours. The initiative that had once powered Nazi victories was gone, eaten up by fear and bureaucracy. Where German officers wrote for permission, Americans improvised. Where the Wehrmacht hesitated, the U.S. Army found opportunity. It was the triumph of a decentralized, information-rich, and innovative war machine, values that had grown out of American industry and culture, now refined on the battlefield. After the war, surviving German generals, men who had invented and perfected the doctrine of rapid war, grappled with the reality that the U.S. Army had beaten them at their own game. Questioned by Allied historians, top staff like General Gunther Blumentritt and even Heinz Guderian, the architect of Blitzkrieg, admitted the same bitter truth. The Americans, they wrote, had outmaneuvered, outsupplied, and outthought a famous German doctrine Germany itself could no longer practice. Blumentritt called Patton the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies, a man who seized opportunities at the speed of lightning. Guderian conceded that Patton had acted as he himself would have if only he'd been given the freedom. The ultimate irony was that, while German officers paid with their lives for initiative, U.S. Army High Command gave their subordinates more rope and watched them win with it. Mission command, as practiced in 1944 by Americans, became the model for modern U.S. military leadership: trust, speed, adaptability, and decentralized boldness from top to bottom. August 1944 was the agonizing, undeniable sign that the era of rigid command was over. America's vision of open decision-making, fueled by information and initiative, left the old world behind. World War II's most powerful lessons weren't just about tanks or bombs, they were about the power of leadership, American values forged under fire, and systems flexible enough to seize history's fleeting opportunities. The U.S. Army's unstoppable drive across France rewrote the future, not just for one battle but for every generation of warfare that followed. As the Germans looked back, forced to confront how their empire had unraveled, the answer was clear. America's way of war had become the new global standard, relentless, innovative, and unbreakable in the face of uncertainty.